Greetings, I'm Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this T-34 with D-5T from Plant 112 in spring 1944. This is a 35th scale model from Mini Art, as you can probably tell from the text on the box. Inside the box there's a lot of sprues. I didn't count them, but there's got to be close to 50, and that does sound like a lot until you learn that most of them are small sprues with just a couple of bits on them like these wheel sprues, which I suppose makes sense, especially for something like a T-34 which has a whole bunch of variants. Instead of making sprues with a whole bunch of parts that probably won't be used, they make smaller, more specific sprues. There is still going to be a lot of parts left over with this kit anyway, and that's not a bad thing. It is nice to have bits for the bits box. Anyway, I'm already waffling, and this is going to be a long video. The parts on these sprues are pretty decent, for the most part. Most of them are moulded fairly neatly, though there are quite a few parts with at least some flash and more prominent mould lines than is ideal, though the ideal is really no mould lines. There wasn't anything I would describe as horrendous, just little bits here and there that will increase cleanup time. Most of it isn't a problem, but I did decide to save myself some time and replace the tracks with a 3D printed set. There's a video about it linked in the description, and I guess I'll talk about it later too. The detail on the parts is pretty good. I haven't built a lot of Mini Art kits, but that is kind of what I've come to expect from them. Good detail and a whole bunch of parts. I don't really know enough about this specific variant of the T-34 to say how accurate the detail is, but it looks pretty convincing to me. There is a little bit of internal detail, though you wouldn't call it a full interior kit, not even kind of. For the most part though, if you want to have some hatches open, it should look pretty reasonable. It is probably also worth noting that some of what looks like flash is in fact moulded in weld beads, so it's a good idea to be careful about what you are scraping off. The clear parts are nice and clear, which is exactly what you want. These are mostly vision devices and lamp lenses. There's also some photo etch. Oh boy, Herbert's favourite. It doesn't actually look like a lot here, but some of this was really annoying to deal with. Your mileage may vary of course. If you actually enjoy doing photo etch, you'll probably enjoy this. Anyway, here's the decals. To me, they look to be a lot less annoying to deal with. And of course, instructions, so we don't have to just guess where hundreds of little bits of plastic go. I do appreciate that these are in booklet form, stapled in the middle, and that the diagrams are clear, and for the most part, easy enough to understand and follow. Other than a couple of areas where I had to think about how things should go, mostly due to the angle of the instructions not being overly helpful, I didn't have any real problems. Let's use these instructions to guide us in building a good stronk T-34 I start with the hull, onto which I attach the escape hatch. This won't be visible, but I did appreciate that it has detail on the inside. Then I add these bits of doodaddery. I'm not totally sure how essential these are to the build, but they do seem to come in contact with the hull sides, so if nothing else, they might add some support and strength there. The wall between the fighting compartment and engine bay goes into place next. There's keying, but nothing else to make sure that it's at a 90-degree angle to the hull bottom. Still, it's not hard to achieve that angle, or at least something close to it. Internal suspension parts come next. This is a simple matter of gluing the spring bits into the shroud things, I guess you might call them. There are 2 of these bigger ones, and 4 smaller ones. Pretty much none of this is going to be visible from the outside, though they do also help align and support the hull sides, and they do have some interaction with the external suspension parts, so it's probably worth installing them. There's a spot of drilling next. We need a couple of holes in the hull side parts. Nothing too tricky about this. We don't need to put anything in them yet, but the holes are there, and they're ready. Next, the side, I guess they're really the floor part of the hull sides. Whatever they are, they go on next, and it's pretty simple. These do have some of those weld beads that could be mistaken for flash, that I mentioned earlier. I follow this with final drive casings. The shape of these is such that it should be quite difficult to put them on wrong. Once those are on, the suspension spring doovers can go on. These two look similar, but there are differences, so make sure you're putting the right one in the correct place. Otherwise there will be consequences, like having an ill-fitting model, I guess. The larger forward ones don't require quite the same attention. They're easy enough to place. There are, obviously, 2 hull sides, and the process is pretty much the same for both. The holes that were drilled earlier are for these little ramps, whatever you want to call them. I believe these are for knocking track pins back in place when they come loose. Why not then add the hull sides to the bottom part? This is pretty easy. There's a lot of parts that more or less link together. You may find you need to apply a little bit of pressure, but there shouldn't be any real difficulties here. Now we have a nice, pretty well detailed lower hull, or partial lower hull, I guess. It is a bit of a shame that all of that detail won't be visible. Next I put the machine gun, with its ball mount, into its mount. The ball portion gets sandwiched between the 2 other parts. If you're gluing all of this together so it won't move, like I am, you might want to have a think about the angle of this relative to how it's going to sit on the front plate. You might not want an MG pointing off in weird directions. And here's that front plate now, having holes drilled into it. The holes are for this little thing, which goes onto the opening for the MG mount. It made sense to install the housing for that next. It's pretty simple. It's also another example of where there's weld beads moulded into the part. The hinge for the driver's hatch comes next. The guide pins make this easy as pie. A bit less tasty though. I follow that with these cable hook thingies. The instructions say to add the photo etch little clip thingies that go above this hook, but I didn't feel like it, so I left it for later. I did quite a lot of that in this build. It's not a bad thing, you just have to make sure you're not skipping over anything that's integral for future steps, and remember to come back and complete the things that you've skipped over. I like to mark my instructions for this purpose. Anyway, I moved on and installed the hull MG. This was a little bit fiddly to get into the correct position, mostly because it's kind of easy to push it too far forward and have it protruding out beyond the casing. The trick is to not do that. While I let that bond for a bit, I added the lower rear plate which, surprisingly, goes here, at the rear of the hull. There is a tiny bit of side-to-side play here. The obvious thing is to get those bits of bracing to sit in the little slots on the floor, though you can see there is a bit of a gap between the plate and the final drive casing on the right side. Something Soviet construction. Next, I add the cover for the whole machine gun. I feel like this somewhat improves the appearance. And then, more drilling. These holes are mostly for handrails, though there is a couple marked option. These are for mounting some kind of round doodad near the front right, and I chose not to drill the holes for it. The instructions also say to remove some nubbins on the outside of the hull. It's not too hard to slice them off and then sand the area, though I would imagine a lot of them would have been obscured by the fuel tanks anyway. The next step is to attach the whole front to the rest of the hull. This wasn't too hard, though you may find you need to apply some pressure to get everything aligned with a minimum of gaps. I follow that by joining the upper hull assembly to the lower hull. I would suggest leaving some time for the previous step to bond before doing this. You probably don't want to push the front plate out of position. The fit isn't too bad, though again, you will probably need to use some pressure. Also, I did this in sections. The front first, and then, when I was happy with it, I glued the sides into place. Then, we add the pointy bit to the front of the hull. I wasn't totally sure if I was putting this on the right way up, but I think I did. If I didn't, Soviet construction. At the back of the hull, we have this internal support bit, I guess you might call it. I ummed and ahed about whether or not it was worth installing this. While I pondered, I began adding bits to the upper rear plate, like the exhausts. These need to be slotted into place from the inside, so obviously this has to be done before installing the plate on the hull, which is what I chose to do next. I decided against installing the inner part. There didn't really seem to be any need for it, though if you want, you could model this plate open, and that would be a good feature to have. The plate isn't a perfect fit, there is a bit of a gap on the sides, mostly the left side, but again, Soviet construction. I'm pretty sure I said that way too many times on the build streams for this kit. I continued adding details to the rear, like the smaller round hatch, which could also be modelled open if you chose. I guess if you were really determined to have open hatches, you could 3D print some internal detail. I obviously didn't do that, having just thought of it now while doing the voiceover. The little handle goes onto the hatch next, and it's a lot easier to put this on now rather than before installing the hatch, as the instructions seem to suggest. Shrouds for the exhausts come next, and thanks to the guide pins, they pretty much drop right into place. Then these whatever they are, go into place here. There's one for either side, and they're not exactly hard to get into place. I'm not really sure what they're for, but I suspect they might be to help deflect stuff so that it doesn't go into the turret ring. Now seems as good a time as any to add these louvers to the engine deck. There isn't much to hold these in place, but you can model them as open or closed as you like. It is really easy to knock these out of place though, so I set them aside to bond and installed the mounts for the idler wheels at the front of the hull. It made sense, and the instructions said to follow this by adding the outer part of the idler mount. The little locking teeth? I don't know what this is called, but they do function as you think. There's nothing to key the part into a particular position, so I referred to the instructions and just kind of guessed at what looked right. If you were to replace the tracks in this kit with workable links, you could, in fact, leave this off until you've got all the wheels and tracks and stuff ready to go, and install the idler to allow as much slack as you want. Hindsight is 20/20, as the youth say. Back to the engine deck, where I add more louver thingies. These can also be modelled open or closed. They do have a bit more of a contact area, which makes them a bit harder to knock out of place. So I go right ahead and install the central hatch, which drops into place as easy as Sunday morning. Yeah. Why not then install that engine deck? This didn't drop into place as easy as Sunday morning. More like a Monday. I had to apply some pressure to get it to sit down in the hull as it should, and it's still not quite perfect, but again, Soviet construction. The instructions want suspension arms installed at this time, and why not? Most of these require you to add a little thing at the torsion bar end of the part. They can then go onto the hull. They've got a pin on the inside, which interacts with the spring part on the inside of the hull. The forwardmost swing arm is a bit different. You don't need to add the little doodad to it, and it doesn't interact with any springs. And while there is keying, it still has a bit of play to it, so you're going to have to do some eyeballing. The wheel holdy bits also have to be installed, otherwise we can't have wheels. They're not difficult to install, though you'll want to pay attention to the angle of their dangle. They won't automatically sit perfectly straight, so try to get them as straight as you can. Otherwise you'll have wonky wheels, and nobody wants that. I return to the engine deck to add this shroudy bit. This is pretty easy. That's followed by this vent, which is also easy as long as you're using the correct part. It's different for either side. This does totally obscure the louver we installed earlier. Might as well have saved 20 seconds and omitted those. On top of that, I add this handrail. This isn't difficult, though it might be a good idea to leave these off until later. They are quite easy to break. Ask me how I know. Obviously there's a very similar assembly for the left side of the tank, which has magically appeared, so I install the rear grille housing. Let's call it that. This probably won't completely obscure the louvers here, and it's probably not a bad idea to paint the inside here before the next step, which is installing some photo etch mesh. Obviously it's got a curve in it, so it did need a bit of bending. I used the handle of my knife to get the curve shape, though I didn't video it, and it wasn't too hard to get into place. The annoying part is the second bit of photo etch, which is this frame around the mesh. I glued it down in sections, and it was a bit messy, but hey, it's a Soviet tank. I'm using a black flexible superglue here, which I rather like. It has a little bit of working time, which makes stuff like this a lot easier than with the kind that will instantly bond. The result is a bit rough, but I kind of like that. These sort of meshy things are thin and easily bent and damaged. And maybe we can just say any excess superglue is dirt or something. You probably wouldn't even notice it if it wasn't black anyway. Now, more photo etch. This part, which had to be bent to 90 degrees, goes here on the front mudguard. I wasn't really sure I got this in the right place. The instructions were a little bit unclear. Moving right along, I glue those mudguards to the hull. Fortunately, there's a plastic connection point here, though I did use a bit of superglue on the metal parts too. The plastic contact points are doing most of the work. Next, I glue together a pair of spare track links, and these are different to the links you would use on the running gear. They're specifically for this purpose. I then mount them on the right rear of the hull here. I then install a bunch of hand railings into the holes that were drilled for them. It's not a difficult task at all, but as I said earlier, it's probably not a bad idea to leave them off until later. They're quite easy to break. The kit does include a couple of extras, so that's nice, but surely it's better to not break them in the first place. On the left side there's a saw. If you don't have the traditional Soviet log on your tank, you should at least have the ability to procure one. Next, the driver's hatch. I did, in fact, lose the hatch the instructions say to use, which would have required various internal bits that I was never going to use anyway. I guess I got lucky because there was another driver's hatch, so I used that one instead. I'm sure this will upset somebody, but it's better than no hatch at all, probably. I didn't, however, lose the little vision device cover thingies. I've chosen to model mine closed, therefore there was no need to install any of the clear parts inside. I have skipped over a few things the instructions wanted done at this point, mostly to avoid photo etch. So next, I assemble the stove, which is for heating the engine up when the weather is just a little bit cool. There's not a lot to this, it's pretty much just a simple box made up of 4 parts. We might as well install that stove on the rear plate. There's only 4 small contact points for this, so it is something you should be careful with. Next, I made 3 stacks of 6 ice cleats. It is a bit fiddly to get them to sit how you want them, and to stay there, but it can be done. I don't think it has to be perfectly neat either. I don't think they would really be lining them up perfectly neat on the real thing either. The straps for these are photo etch, so I set that aside for later, and attached the inner half of the brackets for the external fuel tanks, the first of which I managed to break, though I was able to glue both parts on separately, and everything was fine. The straps around the outside of the barrels are photo etch, so they can be done later. I move on to the plastic bits of doodadery on the rear lower hull, this bracket thing in the middle, and the 2 hooks on either side of it. These are exactly the same as the ones on the front, and just as easy to install. Here's a toolbox, or at least I think it's a toolbox. It could be for storing cabbages. It's made up of 2 very easy to glue together pieces. Here's another box. This one consists of 4 pieces, which are also very easy to glue together. This one doesn't have any extra details to add to it, but this one that I'm gluing onto the left rear of the hull here does. Some photo etch latches. Later. The other box goes on a bit further forward, and neither of them are difficult to get into place. I decided it was time to suffer some of that photo etch. These little doovers, tie-down loops, they're the part around which the straps for the ice cleats will go. They didn't need any bending, they've just got to be carefully glued into position here on the right side. They don't look perfect, but I suppose they'll do. Even with the flexible superglue I'm using, it's really easy to knock these out of place, so it may be a good idea to leave these until a bit later when you don't have to handle the model quite as much. There is also meant to be a corresponding loop on the hull side, but I figured it wouldn't be seen behind the cleats, so I didn't bother with it. They were going to be visible on this side of the tank though, so I installed them, along with the outer ones, like on the other side. This is where a large roll of some sort would be strapped down. The instructions describe this as folded canvas. The kit doesn't include a part for this, and I didn't feel like making it, so we'll just have empty strap thingies here. Perhaps the roll has been stolen by no good punk kids. How about some fiddly plastic bits? Oh boy! These linky things, shackles or whatever they are. The shackles themselves aren't too bad, but I did struggle a bit with the central pin thing that holds them in place. Eventually though, I got everything where I wanted it, and moved on to assembling the fuel drums. These do have a bit of keying, and they go together pretty easily, though you may have to do a bit of nudging to get them to look neat. That raised line along them is intentional detail, and not a mega thick mold line. The ends are also keyed and more or less plop right into place. There are some very small guide nubbins for handles, but those are photo etch, so they can wait. There's a recess for the filler cap, and it goes into position at an angle, which should end up being more or less horizontal when they're mounted on the tank. Now seemed like a really good time for wheels. First, the drive sprockets. It's a kind of wheel. There's keying so the halves line up with each other properly, so the guide horns will slot in. Then, the road wheels. There was quite a lot of flash on these, which means they took a lot of time to clean up. Assembly is easy enough though. You glue the hubcap on, and the 2 halves of the wheels together. There is in fact 2 kinds of road wheels in the kit. For one of the variants the kit can make, you would replace the first and last road wheels with ones that have smooth tyres. I don't know why, that's just the way it is. The idler wheel is assembled in pretty much the same way. There isn't much of a contact surface holding them together though, so you do have to be a bit careful. They can then go onto the hull at the front, like so. Then the drive sprockets go on at the rear, and these are just glued straight onto the final drives. A lot of kits would have a polycap here, so the sprocket can be moved when installing the tracks. This kit doesn't, and that is a minor inconvenience, at least if you're going to replace the tracks with workable links. The road wheels go on next, and these weren't all that good. You can see that I've hacked at one of the axles because I couldn't get the wheel on neatly. It was difficult to get all the wheels on nice and straight, even when the axles were straight, and it took a lot longer to get these on than the few seconds of video here would suggest. Then I start assembling the tracks. These do look pretty good, but every single link has a mold line, and the sprue gates are on the long sides of the tracks, so there is significant cleanup for every single link, and you need 144 of them in total. Also, they won't stay together with friction alone, so you have to glue them. I have a 3D printer, and I thought, why not use it? And I replaced the included tracks with a 3D printed set. I made a video about that, there's a link in the description. I won't be going into detail here, so go and check it out. There is still a lot to do on the hull, and a lot of it's photo etch, so now it's time to work on the turret. First, there's a few holes that need to be drilled. These are for hand railings, so I guess if for some reason you don't want those, don't drill the holes. Then these internal walls go into place. The detailing on them won't be visible though, because I won't be modelling any open hatches, but as you can probably see, they do protrude down below the sides of the turret. It seems like they'll help align the two halves of the turret, so it's probably not the worst idea to put them on. Vision devices come next. The instructions say to add these collars, I guess they are, onto the periscopes first, but it's easier to glue the collars into place first, and then let them bond so you don't immediately push them back out of place. While that's happening, I add the ventilation covers at the rear of the turret. This is about as simple as it looks, though I did find I needed to apply a bit of pressure for a gap-free fit. I then install the periscopes, which are clear plastic. I'm not worried about these staying clear, so I just used plastic cement to glue them into place. This can cause clear parts to fog up, so if you're worried about that, you'll have to use something else to hold them in place, like PVA or glue and glaze. I heard commanders like cupolas, so it's a good idea to put one together, and this one went together nice and easy. There are some clear vision devices that go in here, but I left them out because they're not going to be visible anyway. The cupola then goes onto the left side of the turret roof, exactly where you think it would go. You can see there's some of those weld beads here, so you do have to kind of nudge the part around so there aren't any gaps around that. I mean, you can fill gaps, but it is better if you don't have to. Next, this ring goes into the top of the cupola, like so. This allows for the installation of the hatch parts without them falling into the turret. The two end parts have tabs that fit into the slots on the ring. I used the middle hatch parts to kind of force the end ones into the correct position. It did take a bit of fiddling, kajiggering and pressure, but eventually the hatch is in place. The forward flap has a vision device, which is assembled in the same way as those on the forward parts of the turret, just I didn't film it. The loader's hatch is next, and this is a simple part that plops right into place with minimal fiddling. There is a tiny little doodad that goes into the hinge, presumably to stop the hatch from going all the way forward. The instructions weren't super clear with this, but I think I got it in the right place. There is also some internal detail for the loader's hatch, including some photo etch, but that is another part nobody's ever going to see, so it was omitted. Something else with a lot of internal parts that won't be seen is the main gun. I only assembled the bare minimum for this, which is pretty much these two parts, which come together to form the internal part of the gun and the gun breech. Unless you want the extra detail, like if you're modelling an open hatch, this is pretty much all you need to hold the gun inside the turret. We do also need this inner turret ring part. The instructions would have you install this from above, but I just couldn't get that to work. It does go in from below the turret part very easily though. Here's the inner portion of the gun mantlet. Into this I glue one half of the gun holdy bit. The bigger one, which will be easier to position. It goes on the left side. It's a pretty good idea to let that bond for a bit so it won't just move out of position. I then attach the other gun holdy bit, which if you were wondering is the technical term. I attach this to the gun first, and then, so it doesn't bond in the wrong position, I quickly insert it into the mantlet part. Then I kajigger it all so it's as straight as I can get it. This is also where you'll have to decide on your gun's elevation. That is, unless you want to be a bit more precise with your gluing and allow the gun to move. There are no polycaps though, so it will just flop around. I then glue that mantlet and breech assembly into the lower turret part. The shape is a bit weird, and the instructions don't really do a good job of showing what it looks like, but if you fiddle around with it, you'll figure it out.
Oh, you mean test fitting?
Yes, I do. Once it's in place and bonded, it's time to attach the top of the turret. I did have to trim these inner wall parts a fair bit to get a good fit, which was kind of annoying, but they did also help guide the fit. I'm not totally happy with the join here. It is going to need a bit of extra work before painting time, but the turret is together, and that's probably the important thing. Another somewhat important thing is the main gun, and it slots into place nice and easily here in the front of the breech part that we installed earlier. Big surprise, I know. Then the outer mantlet can be slid down over the gun and into place here. Do make sure it's up the right way. Lifting doovers for the turret come next. There are some obvious slots for these, which makes it very easy to get them into place. Then on both sides of the turret, there's a couple of little cone-shaped doodads that go onto these flattened areas. I've no idea what they are. Maybe they're pistol ports or something like that. I don't know. I'm not a T-34 surgeon. Whatever they are, there's no keying, so you will have to do a bit of eyeballing. The antenna then goes here, to the left side of the commander's cupola. Simple enough. This is easily broken though, so be careful with it. Then, hand railings for the turret. These are just as easy to install and just as breakable as those on the hull. There is also a nubbin that should be shaved off above the rear hand railing. The instructions say to slot spare track links in behind the hand railings, which I will do, but I didn't do that at this point. Now it's finally time to deal with all of those annoying little bits of photo etch I left until later. It was bound to catch up with me eventually. First, the latches for the rear toolbox. I figured it was probably easiest to glue one part onto the box first, the part that kind of hooks onto the latch mechanism. It's not too difficult to get on, it does need a bit of bending though. Here's the rest of the latch parts. With stuff like this, it's small and annoying, and ends up taking so long that often I kind of forget to video it, or the video I do get is just garbage. It's something I'm trying to work on, but I am from the 1900s, you gotta cut me some slack. Anyway, here we see the latches installed on the model. They do kind of look a bit messy when you look at them closely, so maybe Ivan, the driver, has brushed the tank up against something and damaged them. Sometimes it's fun to make up stories. The ice cleats come next. There's 3 sets of 6 cleats with photo etch straps holding them down. Because it would have been infuriating to try and wrap the strap around the inner loops, I've omitted them. It wasn't too hard to get the straps around the outer loops, but it was still kind of annoying. I trimmed the straps down a bit and bent them down behind the cleats. I made sure the little buckle would be visible, and according to the instructions, that meant installing the straps the wrong way around. This does look kind of messy up close. This is a candidate for being covered with either mud or a tarp or something. Here's something that surprised me with how much less difficult it was than I'd expected. It was still fiddly and kind of annoying, just a bit less than I'd imagined. These little, I don't know what they are, retainers for stuff being hooked onto the towing hooks on the front and rear hull. The instructions seem to want this assembled before being put onto the hull, but it's easier to glue the photo etch part down, and when it's firmly bonded into place, insert the plastic part. Then you just bend the metal part to sandwich it into place. Another not so difficult piece of photo etch are the handles for the fuel drums. I did, of course, only put these where they'll be visible, so the ends of the drums that go against each other on the tank's right have no handles. It doesn't matter when they're installed, unless you look real close. I did, in fact, put these barrels on backwards. I didn't notice until after I'd got the left one on, and I didn't feel like pulling it back off, so I didn't. According to the instructions, the seam is meant to be on the outside, though I don't think it really matters that much. Back to the annoying photo etch, by which I mean the straps for the fuel drums. You can see here I've bent both ends according to the instructions, and glued the plastic doober in the middle. There isn't anything to indicate exactly where these parts need to be bent, and the result is that everything is slightly different, which is kind of annoying. Let's just say it once again, Soviet construction. I don't think I installed these quite as you're supposed to. There doesn't seem to be anything for the top of the straps to actually link into, but there are nubbins there that seem to help stop the end from lifting up. I glue the top half into place, then later, once I'm sure it's bonded, I glue the lower half into place, trying to get the end of the strap against the nubbiny bit underneath. The result is not the best, All of the straps are uneven, and when it comes down to it, that is due to my own incompetence. It would have been nicer if these parts were a bit more user-friendly though. We'll just yet again chalk it up to good old Soviet construction. There is another bit of photo etch that goes on the rear mudguards. I didn't film myself installing it, but it is very similar to the stuff on the front. It seemed like a good idea to leave these off until after the tracks were in place. Having non-rotating, firmly glued in place drive sprockets, it's probably a good idea to leave a bit of space to work in when installing the tracks, which is what I did next. As I probably mentioned earlier, I was quite uninterested in spending hours cleaning up the kit's tracks, so I 3D printed a replacement set. This did take a bit of time itself, but in the long run it still saved a lot of time, and I think they look pretty good. If you want more detail on these 3D printed tracks, I made a video about it a couple of weeks ago, and it's linked in the description. Now that the tracks are on, I installed the rear mudguard flap thingies. The left one was a little bit more fiddly than the right, which doesn't quite look right. Perhaps I've messed this up. I then went back over the instructions to find anything else I might have skipped over. The headlamp was one of them. The clear lens the instructions wanted me to use went flying and was devoured by the carpet monster. Bastard. There was another one, so I used that. It didn't quite seem to fit as well as the other one, but it's better than no lens. Before installing that on the hull, I deal with the horn, which has a photo etch bracket. That's why I didn't install it earlier. I'm not sure if I've got this bracket on the right way or not, but it was easier to put it on this way, so that's the way I did it. I glue it onto the hull, and because I'm really good at what I do, I did this out of frame. It is in what seems to be the correct location though. I then add the headlamp. There's a small line that I think is meant to act as a guide for this, though you wouldn't call it keying. It's probably not quite in the perfect location, but it's good enough for Soviet work. And that's it. There's nothing else to add, unless you count attaching the turret to the hull. Attach is kind of a strong word. There's no locking tabs or anything like that. Friction will hold it good enough. I've replaced a couple of handrails that were too broken to glue back together, and I've also damaged the antenna. That could easily be replaced with some styrene or brass rod, but I'm going to leave it for now. So the 35th scale T-34 with D-5T from MiniArt is now completed, and for the most part I'm pretty happy with the result. I feel like there's a couple of areas that don't look great, like some of the photo etch parts being a bit messy and uneven, but that's really only something that stands out when you're looking at the thing up close a lot. There are a couple of things missing from the final build, like the towing cable. I somehow lost the piece of wire for that, and I am pretty sure it was there when I opened the box. These things happen. Also, there is meant to be a canvas roll in front of the left fuel drum, which I didn't feel like making. It's not really a big deal though. Those parts could be off the tank temporarily, being used by the crew, or maybe they've been stolen by criminal scumbags. Obviously it would look a lot better when painted, perhaps with some extra detail to help with visual storytelling. That sort of thing can help disguise or create visual explanations for anything that's a bit odd, missing, or just out of place. That said, I don't actually intend to paint this anytime soon. I've got other things I want to paint. If you watched the build streams, or have been around my channel for a while, you'll know that I'm not the biggest fan of photo etch, so unsurprisingly, I didn't really enjoy working with most of it on this kit, and it did add hours to the build time, but some of it really does look quite good. It does help with some of the detail, like the clip things on the front and rear of the hull, and the latches on the rear box are also quite nice, if a bit damaged. The plastic also had its unenjoyable moments. The wheels weren't very good, and obviously the tracks motivated me to 3D print a replacement set because I could see how annoying they were going to be to deal with. Though in fairness, most of the plastic parts are very good, even though some of them did need a fair bit of cleanup. The detail is very nice. It's ended up looking very much like a T-34 and I can't really complain about that. It's probably actually the nicest T-34 I've got, especially in regards to detail. This is a good kit. I guess I don't really have much else to say about this. The video is already 6,000 hours long, so if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section below. If you'd like to watch me building kits like this one live, I stream modelling a couple of times a week over on Twitch. There's a link you can check out in the description. Subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of thing, share it with anybody you think might find it helpful, and if you really like what I do, consider supporting on Patreon or Ko-fi. There's links for those in the description as well. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.